I'm Dr. Leonard Wallach. I'm the founder and the program coordinator for the Herman P. and Sophia Taubman Endowed Symposia in Jewish Studies here at UCSB. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to a very timely discussion of the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks in historical perspective that features Ambassador Dennis Ross and Ghaith Al-Omari. Their visit to campus has been made possible through the generous support of the Taubman Foundation, the Tobes Foundation, Julianne Friedman, Julianne Hyman, and Lou and Bernice Weider, all of whom we are deeply grateful to. Today's event is also the outgrowth of a highly successful, innovative educational program that was established here in the fall of 2009 with the help of David Makovsky of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and Ghaith Al-Omari, who's the executive director of the American Task Force on Palestine and from whom you'll be hearing soon. And that particular dialogue has become a model that they have taken to more than 40 campuses nationwide. Each academic quarter, a small group of student leaders from Jewish, Muslim, and Middle Eastern organizations have joined a distinguished group of speakers to engage in thoughtful, challenging, and open-minded dialogue, ranging from religious identity to national security, from sacred space to secure borders. And some of those who've led these dialogues have been Ethan Bronner, the Jerusalem correspondent for the New York Times, Helmi Kitani, the Center for the Jewish Arab Economic Development in Israel, and also this fall, U.S. Ambassador to Egypt and Israel, Daniel Kurtzer. Inspired by the great success of the dialogues in the winter of 2012, we began experimenting with two other educational models in which Makovsky and Al-Omari have co-taught an upper division course on Jerusalem with Professor Richard Hecht here in the Department of Religious Studies, who also serves as the chair of the program committee for the Taubman Symposia. And they've also convened a series of peace negotiations in which pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian students assume and argue each other's viewpoints. If you've ever seen an exercise in consternation and revelation, believe me, the dialogues and the peace negotiations are truly remarkable experiences. We had a peace negotiation today that was befuddling, thoughtful, fascinating, discombobulating for those with easy and simple views of the Middle East conflict. Since Makovsky has now joined the U.S. State Department as a senior advisor to the Special Middle East Envoy, Ambassador Martin Indyk, we sought another distinguished expert on the Middle East to participate in today's much anticipated public event. Who better than one of our country's most eminent diplomats and scholars and a leader in shaping U.S. policy in the region, Ambassador Dennis Ross. And as I look over the roster of foreign policy makers and analysts to whom our undergraduates have enjoyed direct access over the last 4.5 years, I have to say I feel a tinge of envy. You'd think they were at Georgetown or Princeton. But the enduring value of the dialogues and the peace negotiations rests not upon what we teach our students about Jews and Muslims, or the Israelis and the Palestinians at any particular moment in time. Rather, their significance may be found in an assumption they share, that peace among peoples is only possible through ongoing communication and ceaseless effort. Where peace is concerned, disengagement on either side is simply not an option. That said, let the dialogue begin.
Good evening, and once again, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to another Taubman Symposium in Jewish Studies. over the many years that I have been introducing these symposia, we have returned, as many of you know, again and again, to the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and also the processes that might lead to a successful agreement between these two people who have so much to share in common. Our conversation this evening is taking place at a critical moment, at a critical juncture, if you will. For more than 6 months, Israeli and Palestinians have been in discussion about U.S. Secretary John Kerry's initiative that in just a few weeks may culminate in the draft of a framework for further negotiations and perhaps even a final agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. We could not have two better people to help us understand the issues and the processes that are now taking place between my friend Ghaith Al-Omari and Ambassador Dennis Ross. There are several decades of direct experience with the Israeli and Palestinian conflict and with negotiations. Ambassador Ross, as you know from reading the program bulletin, has served as a special assistant to President Obama and to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton, and for more than 12 years has played a singular role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process. Among his many publications, and I really recommend it to you, even though he told me just a short while ago that he's published several other books since, is The Missing Piece, and the inside story of the fight for Middle East peace, which is an extraordinary, in my opinion, narrative and analysis of the last major American initiative during the waning days of the Clinton administration. This is Ghaith Al-Omari's 4th visit to our campus. He loves coming here, especially given the weather conditions in Washington, D.C. On each of his visits, he has been involved, as Leonard noted just a short while ago, in dialogues between Jewish and Muslim students and in student working groups learning about the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in a very pragmatic and hands-on way. And he's also been joining my classes. And every time he comes to my class on the religion and politics of Jerusalem, it's a stunning, absolutely stunning presentation. So before taking his position as the executive director of the American Task Force on Palestine, he was the director of the International Relations Department in the office of the Palestinian president, and of course an advisor, as you know, also from the program brochure to former Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas. And he was directly involved in various negotiations at Camp David and as well at Taba. So it's my great pleasure to have these two individuals here, and I will try to make my questions to them as succinct as possible, and I'll begin with a historical question because, as you know from the title of our conversation, it's trying to put the Israeli-Palestinian talks going on now in a historical perspective. So let me begin with an open question to the two of you by asking to tell us about, or to talk to us about why earlier rounds of negotiations were unsuccessful or were unable to achieve a comprehensive agreement.
Well, first, thank you for having me. And I don't want to say the weather had anything to do with it, but this morning when I left Washington, D.C., it was 19 degrees. That was Fahrenheit. So it's really a chore to be here, I have to tell you. And let me also say it's really a pleasure also to be with Ghaith, because I think of all the people I've known and worked with over the years on this conflict, there's few who I think have been more determined to want to see it end. And had we had more people like Ghaith working on these issues, we would have solved it. I mean, this is my leading remark in response to your question. Why have the previous rounds not succeeded? Well, there's multiple explanations. First, I think we had certain moments during the Clinton administration where there was a possibility to do things, in part because you had an American president who, after the assassination of Rabin, was on a mission. Those who think that he was focused on the issue of legacy completely misunderstood him. He told Rabin in their first meeting in March of 1993, "You take risks for peace, and my responsibility is to minimize the risks." And when he was assassinated, Clinton felt he had a debt, he had an obligation. And so he was determined to do everything he could to try to produce a peace. So you had an essential ingredient on the American side. You had, I think on the Israeli side, you had a leader, Rabin, who, before he was assassinated, had the personal credibility to succeed, and he was assassinated, so you lost him. That didn't mean that without him you couldn't succeed, but it wasn't easy to create a circumstance where you'd have other leaders who would have the same credibility. Truth be told, Shimon Peres, in the aftermath of the assassination, had a kind of credibility that he, under other circumstances, would not have had, but it was done in by 4 bombs in 9 days. The end of February, the beginning of March of 1996, Hamas and Islamic Jihad carried out 4 bombs in 9 days. At the time, Peres in many ways was unassailable, and Peres was determined to fulfill the legacy of Rabin. But the whole image of the peace process was literally exploded by those 4 bombs in 9 days. The Israeli public went from believing that they had a partner in the Palestinians, and they actually believed it, because when Rabin was assassinated, there was a genuine outpouring of grief among Palestinians. What if I do this? Okay. It surprised the Israeli public because their image of the Palestinians was very different prior to that time. And so once they saw, I can handle it, okay. Now, of course, you run the risk I'm going to break into song, so it's once they saw this, they really felt that they had a partner, and that was transforming. But they also believed that peace was going to come. Now, when you had 4 bombs in 9 days, it simply undercut and undermined the very foundation of what was going on. So you ask, why did we fail before? Well, that was one important reason, because then Peres was defeated. And Netanyahu, when he came in 1996, he came in with a premise that says, we're not going to do anything until we see security reestablished. And he established at that time a set of standards that, in a sense, Arafat, in truth, wasn't prepared to meet. Later on, when Barak is elected, Barak is prepared to go to great lengths, but Barak also is focused on the Syrian track, not the Palestinian track. And when you might have done things, the truth is, we might have succeeded on the Syrian track, and that might have fundamentally colored what would have happened with the Palestinians, and that was certainly Barak's assumption. But when he was ready to move, Assad wasn't, and when Assad was ready to move, he wasn't. And we had a window that closed very quickly, and then Assad died, and you lost it, and then Arafat saw himself being the only game in town. But it wasn't just he saw himself being the only game in town. He was, and I remember seeing him right after the Israelis withdrew unilaterally from Lebanon. And Hezbollah basically opened the prisons, and they said, look, we get everything. Resistance worked, we get everything. Arafat negotiations, they throw him crumbs. The most angry I ever saw Arafat in all my meetings with him, and I had, God knows how many meetings I had with him, the most angry I ever saw him was at that moment, where he felt that, he was being vilified in the Arab world and made to look a fool. I do think the seeds of the Second Intifada were planted then, when he decided, you know what, I'm going to show I can get something too. Now that of course comes a couple months after Camp David, where he doesn't move one iota. As Clinton says in the last day to him, we've spent 15 days here and you haven't moved a millimeter. And part of it was, I think, he was going to demonstrate in a different way that, he could resist also. And the Second Intifada then killed the peace camp in Israel. I mean, think about it. You know, you have Ehud Barak, who at Camp David is prepared to divide Jerusalem. You know, he goes with a proposal that, by the way, doesn't go as far as the Clinton parameters 5 months later, which we present as in response to both sides asking us to present a bridging proposal. And not only is that turned down, as well as the performance of Camp David, but you have violence and then you have bombings. And it completely destroyed the peace camp in Israel. They've not recovered to this day. Because it looks like, okay, when you reach out, what you got in response was violence. So you lost those opportunities. If you look at Annapolis, you know, my problem with Annapolis was that there was good news and bad news. The good news was you actually had a serious negotiation that was done by the parties for a year. The bad news was, as time went on, the political authority of Ehud Olmert was declining all the time. After the Lebanon conflict, you know, he basically lost his credibility within Israel. You know, his approval ratings were in the single-digit area. At one point, you know, I said it was actually within the margin of error of the poll. And so he's then in a position where he doesn't have great political authority. Tzipi Livni is negotiating with Abu Allah, and they have their own track. And it's a serious track, but also they're both, in a sense, neither one of them are crossing certain thresholds. I mean, you know this very well. You know exactly what was going on there. Olmert has a parallel approach with Abu Mazen. At one point, he puts a proposal on the table, and Abu Mazen never responds to it. Now, you can say he didn't respond to it because he said, look, if I respond to it and I agree to it, I'm dealing with a guy who probably can't deliver what he's putting on the table. I can tell you that one, I won't say who it was now, but one leading figure internationally, about 4 days after the Obama election in 2008, he and I were together and he asked me the question, why did I think that Abu Mazen had never responded to Olmert? And so I went through all the reasons. Well, he didn't want to expose his concessions at a time when, you know, Olmert probably couldn't have delivered. But I knew the reason he was asking the question was because he was really saying, do you think that Abu Mazen can ever agree to anything? Look at what Olmert was prepared to offer. And he doesn't even draw a response. And the essence of this question was, is he really up to making a deal? And that brings me to where we are today. You know, you presented this, and we'll get into this more, what Secretary Kerry is trying to do using, you know, what is required. It's a necessary condition to have this kind of intensive, energetic involvement. It's not sufficient, because at the end of the day, we're not the ones who make the peace. We can help create the conditions for the two sides and the circumstances when the two sides may find it difficult on their own to create it, but ultimately they have to make these historic decisions. And one of the things I've often described is in all the negotiations that I conducted with them, I always was struck by the sense of the weight of history on their shoulders. You know, we can sit here and we can be highly rational and highly analytical, and we can talk about the logic of doing this and why it makes sense, and we can talk about what is the way to resolve each of these issues as if we're in a laboratory. But they're not in a laboratory. They exist in a real world where all these issues, the core issues, and particularly the narrative issues of Jerusalem and refugees, are part of historic narratives that have been told over and over and over again. And you now, as a leader, have to take on history and mythology. And to say it's daunting is an understatement. So you require leaders who decide that they're going to make history. And the question is, do you have leaders who are prepared to do that? And we'll get more into this, but I'll say, you know, in the next weeks and months, we're going to find that out.
I mean, first of all, thank you very much for having me again. Thank you for this introduction and for raising the bar of expectations of what I have to deliver now. It's strange being here without David Makovsky, but I take solace by the fact that he's freezing in DC while I'm here enjoying this, and it's really an honor to be with Dennis. one of the most thoughtful and effective people I've ever had the pleasure of working with. I'm not going to repeat kind of the sequence of events that you mentioned. I tend to agree with a lot of it, but I'm going to try to abstract some of the dynamics that I saw and some of the reasons what I saw where things were not moving. I would say, first of all, I think part of it is that the issues themselves were not always ripe. We did not always know what is the solution to all of these issues. It's easy today to say that we know what the contours of a peace deal would look like, or at least we know what are the menu of options of how different issues will be dealt with. That was not always the case. When I first got engaged in the negotiations in 1999, our first few sessions with the Israelis were we were experimenting to see what is possible, what is doable. We'll float ideas that they will flip about, and then we go home and retweak them. They will say things that we will get crazy about, and they go home and they retweak them, until we get to a point where we got to know what the issues are. But that took us time. And I would even say in Camp David, we were pushing and exploring some of the ideas. What seemed, impossible at the beginning of Camp David, we actually had some breakthroughs. Jerusalem being one issue, where it became very clear at the end that this is an issue that we can work with. So I think part of why we haven't managed to get the solution in the past is we didn't know what the actual doability, what's the margin that either side can play with. With this one, I'm actually more comfortable these days. I don't know, I think it's a mistake to say that we know the solution, but at least we know what are the range of possibilities on each of the issues, and therefore coming up with this, building this jigsaw is not as difficult as it was maybe 10 years ago. The other issue that also you touched upon, Dennis, is the issue of political ripeness. Political readiness. And one of the actual, tragedies of this conflict is we've never had the political timelines synchronized between the two sides. In my experience, again, with the negotiations of 99 until the collapse after Taba, is, at the beginning of this process, I think Arafat had the political capital to actually go and do it. He had built it up in the years before. He had built it up in the way he dealt with Netanyahu, and then when Barak came here. Yet, as you mentioned, Barak was busy working the Syrian track. By the time that Barak started paying attention to the Palestinian track, by that time, I think Arafat was already, as you mentioned, in shaky grounds, and therefore, we had missed that moment. Equally with the Abbas-Olmert. When Abbas first came to power, it took him time to consolidate, etc. By the time he got to a point where he was ready to move forward, Olmert was gone by that time. A third element, I think, is that, and maybe it's even deeper than these two, is neither side truly understood the damage that they were doing to the other side by certain behavior. You mentioned the issue of the suicide bombings and the issue, and I would take it a bit even larger than that. And I would say, for the longest time, Palestinian leadership did not understand how the failure to really impose security, how fundamentally it undermined Israeli trust. And I think here as a footnote, when we finally had a Palestinian leader, Salam Fayyad, who understood the necessity of not only implementing security, but implementing clear, rational systems of security with which the Israelis could feel a sense of comfort, things changed dramatically. So, but by and large, there was no understanding from the Palestinian side of how deep the issue of security was vis-a-vis Israel, and the flip, of course, on the Israeli side, they never understood how damaging the issue of settlements is to the Palestinian narrative. I was at the AIPAC conference on Sunday, and I kept on hearing over and over from some of the questioners and some people who came after the session, all these arguments to convince me that the settlements are not the real problem. And I was struck, because at the end of the day, give me all of the rational arguments that you want to give me. I know for Palestinians, seeing the settlement expansion is the clearest indication for them that the Israelis are not serious. Politics is not always about rational analysis. It is about the perceptions, and the perception on the Palestinian side was the issue that settlements indicated the Israelis were not serious. So we had a long time where the two sides really did not understand what made the other one tick. The last point I would really mention, and it will bring us to today to some extent, is that in many ways we have been spoiled throughout the history of peacemaking in the region, by having these great leaders, these historical leaders who through acts of leadership changed the map of the region, changed the map of their own countries. I mean, you look at Sadat. One day he lands in Jerusalem and the region changes. It was not popular with his public, it was not popular with the Arab world, yet he's a guy who felt that this is something that had to be done. And it definitely changed history. You look at Rabin, you talked about Rabin. You look at Ariel Sharon, who looked at an Israeli political map that did not allow any movement, by an act of will and with great skill, reshaped the Israeli political map. You look at King Hussein of Jordan, when a Jordanian soldier killed, I think, 7 Israeli girls, I mean, little school girls. The king goes to Israel and goes to the homes of the bereaved families and begs for forgiveness. These are acts of leadership. And so we get ready. We start expecting that every leader, and peace is made through these acts of leadership. And of course, if we have leaders like this, the world would change. Yet these are abnormal leaders. Most leaders are just politicians who respond to the kind of incentive that any politician responds to. You talked about Abu Mazen and Olmert. You know, if I was Abu Mazen's advisor at that point, I would have advised him to take the risk, say yes, and turn the next Israeli election, knowing that Olmert is over, yet say yes and turn the next Israeli election into a referendum on peace. Yet, this is the kind of leap of faith and risk-taking that you could not expect from your typical politician. And today, we have 2 leaders. We have Netanyahu, we have Abbas, 2 leaders who I believe, you know, realize, maybe not enthusiastically, not with great joy, but realize that they have to reach peace. Yet, these are not leaders who take the kind of risk, these kind of grand gestures that we are used to. And I think one of the things that I find fascinating by what Kerry is doing is I think he understood that. And he is working now in a very systematic, methodical way on giving them the set of incentive and disincentive, changing their cost-benefit analysis in a way that they will respond to and in a way that will, you know, that he's managing them in ways that you would manage a typical politician. But by its very nature, this is a process that is slower. This is a process that doesn't kind of find its fruition in this big moment of truth. It's a process that is maybe not always one that can generate the kind of excitement and the kind of traction that you would get. And I think we're in this place where you have serious diplomacy with leaders who want to move but who are not willing to take great risks. And sadly, a public that is not excited by a process that they see as a slow process that is very, I mean, from which they are quite detached. You don't see the ability of the leaders to excite the public as we saw in the 90s and beyond that. I think this is one moment we're in, and I think if we start working on maturing the issues, preparing a public, and being sensitive to how certain acts on either side plays on the other side, we might be in a place where we might be able to avoid some of these mistakes that we had done in the past.
You both anticipate the second question, which I'm sure is the question that is on the mind of all 700 or so of you who are here, and that is, well, what is the framework going to look like? And do you think that Kerry has the ability to avoid the factors that have crippled previous negotiations? Why don't you start, Ray?
I think the framework, I mean, first of all, as you rightly said, this is not a framework agreement. We're not putting a document where the sides will have to sign onto, and then this will be the foundation for, you know, it's not a peace treaty. This is a diplomatic tool that is intended to do 2 things, in my view. It's intended, first of all, to push the issues forward a little bit, but not resolve them. But also it is intended to buy time. And that is not a bad thing, by the way. I think one of the issues that we are facing right now is that if I look at the region, we have the Palestinian-Israeli peace track is out of sync with 2 other very important regional timelines. One is Iran and one is Egypt. I find it very hard for the Israelis, but I can't really speak much about the Israelis, I don't know them that well, but definitely for the Arab countries in the Gulf and elsewhere, to do the kind of the expenditure of political capital that we need from the Arabs to get the Palestinians to the point of saying yes, when they are very insecure about what the process with Iran is going to produce. I think buying more time where we get clarity on Iran is something that will help create a different regional environment. The other timeline is Egypt. I am actually amazed that Kerry managed to pull this together with Egypt out of the game. Yet I don't think that we can reach a peace deal without Egypt being involved. And buying some time will get us a sense of where things are heading in Egypt and maybe a possibility of re-engaging Egypt. But the substance, by the very nature of this framework though, the substance will be designed in such a way that will make it hard for the sides to say no. I expect to see some watering down of the issues, some kicking of the can forward, and of course giving the two sides the ability to make reservations on whatever is being presented, so as to make it, first of all, easier for them to say yes, but also harder for them to say no. If we go out of our way to accommodate your interests so much, and then you say no, then clearly you're not interested in peace. And I think neither side want to be in a position where the finger is pointed and they are the ones who are told that you're not gonna have peace. We're gonna have, I think, a deal. This is it's dangerous to predict in this business, but I will predict and will say that probably the sides will say yes. The big question for me though is, the day after they say yes, what's gonna happen on the ground? How do you sell it? How do you sell a deal that makes a lot of sense in diplomatic terms, yet doesn't give you anything concrete to go to the public the next day and say, your life is going to change? The way I've always seen a peace deal working is, you get a peace deal, an implementable one. Yes, we're going to give up on this issue and that issue, but every time I'm assailed by the Hamas or what have you, saying that you sold out on this or that, I will respond to this by saying, yes, but look at the Israeli tanks rolling out of the West Bank. Look at all of the assistance coming in from the Arab world, from the Gulf states, and from the international community. I am giving you a state. Abbas will not be able to say that to his public, nor would Netanyahu, of course, be able to give the victory speech to his public the next day. So for me, as we think of this diplomatic tool, it is very important to think of what we can attach to it to make a difference on the ground. Sometimes when we have a product, by the way, selling a peace deal is like selling anything. It's an act of marketing. And sometimes when you have a product that is not very compelling, you have to give it some good packaging. And you have to add in maybe, a free gift every time you buy the product. So as we do this, what are the free gifts that we can put into place to allow both sides to actually go sell the peace process, this framework, and be able to stay in the negotiating table and to start the real business of negotiating a deal?
Shockingly, I mostly agree with that. Let me say the following. I'm going to describe it a little bit differently, but I'm very much in the same place where Ghaith is. I think let's take a step back. What's Kerry been trying to do? What people haven't fully appreciated is that the two sides were having direct negotiations and they weren't going anyplace. So he stepped in and he got into serious discussions with each of them on each of the core issues. He's had very serious discussions with both sides on borders, security, refugees, and Jerusalem. And while Ghaith said it's true, if you go back to Camp David and then the Clinton parameters, what produced the Clinton parameters, and I was the main author of the Clinton parameters, was an enormous amount of time that we spent with both sides. So we really were in a position to know, all right, not what they wanted, because you don't reconcile wants when you're negotiating or mediating something like this. You're reconciling needs. We got to the point where we could understand what the needs were. And that's what produced the Clinton parameters. Now, at the end of the day, they didn't succeed. And we can have a discussion about that, but they didn't succeed. Now, that was, that was the end of 2000. Here we are, we're in 2014. The region looks different than it did then, so how you approach some of the issues may be a little bit different. But the significant thing that Kerry has done is really deeply go into each of these issues and get a sense of what each side needs. That's the good news, and I could stop there. The bad news is there's some real gaps, and they're not artificial, and they respond to what each side feels they need, and it's not easy to bridge those gaps. So he has a choice. This is, as you said, this is a framework of principles. The purpose of the framework of principles is like what the Clinton parameters were. They're designed to create a picture of how you will resolve each of these issues: refugees, Jerusalem, borders, and security. I suspect what you'll find is that the closer Kerry gets to being in a position where he's ready to present it, he'll begin to create either a very ambitious approach where he says, look, let's see if we can do this, or if he decides, based on the discussions, that the gaps that are there aren't bridgeable at this point, he'll be more specific on those issues where there's more understanding, meaning on borders and security, and he'll be less specific on those issues that are narrative issues, meaning refugees and Jerusalem. Now, the less specific you are, the more vague you are, even if you're giving a direction, which is what I still think will be the case, you are representing an advance, but the problem is, after all this time, you do build a set of expectations, and this gets to Raif's point. In the best of circumstances, let's say that he's actually able to produce the most ambitious approach, and the two sides are asked to say, we agree to negotiate the details based on this. This is the basis. We have reservations, so they're saying yes, but. And the but is designed to give them some political cover. In the best case, the day after, in both societies right now, is going to be a whole lot like the day before. The bigger problem we face is that there's profound disbelief on each side. This is the 20th year of Oslo. I mean, we're past the 20th year. That was 1993. This is 2014. Most of the, both sides basically, the publics on each side say, I've seen this movie, and I don't much like it. And they're not seeing a payoff from it. Israelis look at Palestinians and they say, they don't really believe in two states. They believe in a Palestinian state and a binational state. And Palestinians look at Israelis and they say, they clearly don't believe in two states. If they did, why are they building in our state? So it's the disbelief issue that you're going to have to take on in the best case. Now, if it's not the best case, which is the more likely scenario, because the difficulty of bridging the gaps is such, and the political price that each side pays is such, that it becomes easier not to expose them on the hardest questions. But if that's the case, and you've spent basically almost 9 months, then something has to change, I'll say, in the first days and weeks afterwards, to say to each public, no, something's different this time. Yes, you've seen this movie before, but this is a different movie. Something is different this time. And for Palestinians, they need to see that something's actually changing on the ground. They need to see, as an example, even though this is not something that they're going to do handstands over, if the Israelis were only building within the blocks and only the Jewish neighborhoods of Jerusalem, including East Jerusalem, the Israeli position would be, we're not going to build in your state. We're not building anywhere in what we think should be your state. Okay, maybe you disagree on the size of the blocks, but we're going to negotiate the size of the blocks. But we are not going to build in your state. And we do some other things to show that we mean what we say. So we'll build more housing within the confines of what is Israel. And we'll begin to create incentives for those who live beyond the blocks to come back as a way of showing we mean what we say. In an Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, we're going to allow Palestinians now to engage in extensive economic activity, something they can't do today, as a way of saying, we really don't want to control you. And on the Palestinian side, if they would do things that address the Israeli perception. You know, the level of incitement in the Palestinian media is outrageous. It's outrageous. And it tells the Israeli public they're not ready, they're not getting ready for peace. It fortifies the view that this is not about really two states. The fact that you can't find Israel on a Palestinian Authority map hardly provides reassurance to Israelis that they mean what they say about two states. The fact that there's no preparation of the public for the idea that compromise is a legitimate thing doesn't provide any reassurance. The point is, you need to create a specific set of steps that each side will take to address the concerns of the other about the disbelief of the other's commitment to two states. That needs to happen immediately afterwards. Because then it will say to the publics, this isn't a light switch where suddenly they say, oh, now we get it. But it gives them a reason to take a second look. If we have this achievement where both sides say yes, but, and let's say there's a range from less ambitious to more ambitious. If we don't have something in the first 2 weeks afterwards, we will not be anywhere. Because even though you'll be in a position to go ahead and continue the negotiations, the context for doing what Race was talking about, for these two leaders to have a context in which they then get ready at a certain point to take on history and mythology won't exist. You need to change that context. You asked, the first question was lessons from the past. Well, one of the most profound lessons from the past is what the two of us are saying in slightly different ways. You better change the context. You better create a basis for belief. You better create a basis that shows, peacemaking pays off. And it's for real. Right now, neither one of them can show that. And until they can do that, even if Kerry succeeds with the framework, the ability to move from there to producing an outcome, I think, will be profoundly limited.
Could I follow up, Dennis, with you a bit and ask you, do we get any sense of what these core issues, as you describe them, might look like in the framework? And now we realize, following your discussions, that there's not going to be the decision on them, but what will they look like? What will be in a sense, the give and take within, say, the issue of refugees?
Well, look, here, there's a frame, I'll use my own term, not the framework, but there's a frame within which, and again, this goes back to everything that we did over the years. As I said, I didn't pull the Clinton parameters out of the sky. I didn't make them up. They were based on thousands of hours of talking to each side. Well, thousands of hours of talking to each side begins to tell you, all right, what's the boundaries within which, you can do something? So why don't I go through each of these issues rather than just the refugee issue?
Okay.
All right? Look, on territory, you're going to have the 67 borders with swaps will be the basis on which you begin to sort things out. What do the swaps represent? There are settlement blocks. To put this in perspective, there's 120 settlements in the West Bank. Okay, I'm talking about outside Jerusalem. 120 settlements in the West Bank. To put this in perspective, 4 settlements constitute 45% of the settlement population, the settler population. 4 out of 120. So when you start talking about blocks, and you're talking about within 5 to 6% of the West Bank, close to what's the green line, you can accommodate 80% of the settlers. Not 80% of the settlements, but 80% of the settlers. So what you're talking about is, all right, you're going to end up with 67 that gets adjusted. It's not going to be the June 4, 67 lines, because they're going to be blocks that are incorporated into Israel so that they can incorporate 80% of the settlers. In compensation for those blocks, there's going to be territory that's then given to the Palestinian state. And that you'll work out the border based on how you define the blocks and how you define the swaps. That's roughly how you'll deal with the issue of the territory. On security, the Israelis are going to have to know several things. They're going to have to know that there isn't going to be infiltration of terror. There isn't going to be building of rockets within the West Bank. You see what rockets from Gaza do? Think about the West Bank. The West Bank sits astride every Israeli populated area. If rockets could be fired from the West Bank, you can't fly into Ben Gurion Airport. You think the Israelis are going to accept an outcome that leaves that open? No chance. So the security arrangements that have to be put in place have to address the ability to ensure not just no terror, not just no rockets, but how do you guarantee that those can't be built? It'll involve a lot of cooperation with the Palestinian security forces, and it will involve some kind of Israeli presence in the Jordan River, the length of time to be determined. From an Israeli standpoint, every Israeli prime minister who was serious about this focused on the Jordan River as a security perimeter, partly because Israel has no strategic depth. So there's a combination of factors that lead to why that's important from an Israeli standpoint. So there'll be some kind of presence there. How long? What's the criteria that will be used to determine the point at which they no longer need to be there? Abu Mazen wants a date certain for when Israel withdraws. Israel wants it to be criteria and circumstances driven, performance driven, so that Israel, when it leaves that area, is a function of when the context or circumstances makes it possible and safe to do so. And given all the unknowns, everybody, every time I hear somebody say, well, gee, that's not a realistic scenario. So how many people predicted what's going on in Egypt? How many people predicted what's going on in Syria? I mean, right now, you can understand the Israeli desire for an insurance policy and a set of hedges, given all the unknowns in the region. So the security arrangements are going to have to be worked out to take those kinds of issues into account. Early warning issues, how you deal with airspace, the electromagnetic spectrum, because actually that affects the ability to ensure that your ability to talk to your own military forces isn't disrupted. I mean, all these things will have to be sorted out, and they'll have to be part of the security arrangements. They'll be done at a level of principle, but there'll have to be a basis on which to sort of sort these things out. Refugees, look, if there's a right of return, then you don't have a two-state solution. So you're going to come up with some kind of compensation for those who will not be returning to Israel. They'll have a right of return to their own state. And there'll probably be a set of circumstances under which a limited number, where the Israelis are the ones who can make the decision, are allowed to return to Israel, either under a humanitarian rubric, some family reunification basis, something of that sort that keeps the numbers small. And on Jerusalem, look, at the end of the day, as hard as it is, you're going to get the Palestinians to agree to an outcome where they don't have a capital. You're going to have to have one city that is not divided again, because we're not going to go back to that. But you're going to have a city that has two capitals for two states. I mean, roughly those are the broad principles. Now, are we at a point where the two sides can sign up to something like that? I would say that, just putting it simply, Abu Mazen will find it very difficult to accept some of what Israel is requiring on security. He'll find it very difficult to accept the outcome that I just described on refugees. Bibi will find it very difficult to deal with what I just said on Jerusalem. So, you can get a sense of the boundaries within which you're approaching these issues, but this sort of reinforces the point that the two of us were making about you're probably not at that stage where the two sides can accept something along the lines that I just outlined.
Right. You very eloquently and clearly spelled out the issues. Let me try to kind of guess what they're going to fudge. You said what they're going to say. Let me guess what they're going to fudge. On the issue of borders, yes, they will agree to 67. They will agree to land swaps. What they will fudge is, what's the ratio of land swaps? Palestinians want for every kilometer that the Israelis take to give 1 kilometer within Israel. The Israelis don't want that. So you'll end up with some kind of language, I think, which will indicate some degree of parity, but not equality. So I think this is one thing where we'll see things fudged. On security, I think it all goes down now to the Jordan River. I think many of the issues that you mentioned, which we were grappling with in Camp David and beyond, I think satisfactory solutions have been done. And by the way, here I would say it was a brilliant idea bringing General Allen, the former head of the NATO forces in Afghanistan, to come and do a lot of the security negotiation, because frankly he knows what he's talking about. One of the first times that we have a military expert come and actually engage on military issues on their merits. So the issue becomes the Jordan River, and on that one, I suspect that what you mentioned, the Israelis wanting a performance-based trigger and the Palestinians wanting a date certain, that will be fudged. They will be talking about an Israeli presence for a transitional period, which, by the way, the Palestinians have accepted. Abbas recently talked about 5 years, and leave this for future negotiations. I think on Jerusalem is going to be the most difficult, because that's the circle that really cannot be squared, and I suspect that we will have some kicking down the road situation. Refugees, I think we will have clarity on some of the practical issues, but what we will be stuck with, whether on Jerusalem or refugees or on the new issue that was presented, the issue of Jewish state, we'll be stuck with what do you do with these symbolic components? With all of these rational, practical things, we can find a win-win, or at least, semi-win-win formulations. It is these symbolic issues that will be most difficult. And here, maybe if I'll go back to the first question that you asked, what is the reasons, one of the reasons what we have always failed, is I think among Palestinians and Israelis, we have a fourth monotheistic religion that's been introduced, besides Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. It's called negotiations. We love to negotiate everything you put in front of us. Every issue that we deal with, we like to negotiate. And I think...
I noticed that.
You've been there. And I think some issues simply cannot be negotiated. And I think we will get to a point of complete deadlock when we try to negotiate, say, on the issue of refugees. What is the genesis of the issue of refugees? What was 1948? It was my misfortune in the Taba negotiations to actually be asked to go and negotiate this with my Israeli counterpart. And how can you negotiate something like this? When 1948, in Arabic, it's called the Nakba, the catastrophe. For any Israeli, it was the year where the diaspora ended and the homeland was created. How do you negotiate that? It's impossible. So I think, in a sense, one of the breakthroughs that we have not done is how to start taking some of these narrative issues and move them from the realm of negotiations, which by definition entails the willingness to compromise, and how can you compromise on narrative and identity, and move it to the realm of a different process of sensitization, whereby the Jewish connection to the land, for example, is something that the Palestinian public gets exposed to and starts understanding. The Palestinian, how Palestinians relate to 1948 and to the trauma of 48 becomes something that the Israelis are familiar with and sensitized to. I think this is where a lot of the difficulty that we're facing today, and we will face even more when we get to the issue of negotiating a treaty, will be. And I think this is something that maybe we'll fudge right now, but as long as we this remains in the realm of the negotiation, I think we will end up in a situation where we cannot reach agreement on some of these issues.
I want to ask a question of the two of you about the fact that both communities have very powerful rejectionists who completely reject the idea of any kind of compromise. Any, to use your term, and Dennis's term, the issues of the power of narratives. How will Mahmoud Abbas and Netanyahu and also John Kerry negotiate and marginalize those very powerful rejectionists who could stand as very significant impediments to moving forward, any forward movement?
I suspect you will need, at least I can speak on the Palestinian side, you will need three processes that will have to go at the same time. First of all, I don't think that rejectionists are, one united monolith. And in many conflicts that we have dealt with, in other conflicts, it's important to see how much of the rejectionist camp you can peel off. And you can peel off people in many different ways. You can peel them off by responding to some of their interests and concerns. I mean, it was very interesting, for example, when we were doing another process, it was an informal negotiation process called the Geneva Initiative. How, as we were going into the issues, how the Israeli counterparts were presenting us with demands that did not really make sense in kind of substantive terms, but made perfect sense in the sense that, if you give me, I remember the late Amnon Lipkin Shahak, for example, asking at some point for the deal to include Israeli access to the route from the north to the south of in the Jordan Valley. And I went to Amnon and was like, what is the logic behind that? There is no logic. And Amnon said, no, there is a logic. If you give me this, another 5% of Israelis would sign on to this deal simply because it will make their lives easier. So you have to start looking at some of the demands of the rejectionists that are not ideological rejectionists and see how you can meet them. How can you deal with the settlers in ways that will respond to some of the interests of the settlers? How do you deal with the religious communities on the Palestinian side that will deal with their interests? So this is one, I think, process that has to go on as a negotiation and a political process. Another process is the process of anticipating the inevitable rejectionists coming in and trying to spoil the game. I mean, there is no peace process on earth where, the closer you get to the deal, the more motivated the rejectionists are to spoil it. And they don't do that only by pleasant democratic means. There will be violence, there will be bloodshed, there will be attacks on both sides. We've had instances in the past between the Palestinians and Israelis where ad hocing it managed to actually diffuse some of these tensions. I would actually recommend the book called Negotiating Under Fire by a guy called Matt Levitt, who's in Dennis's Institute, to show you some of these instances. But there were instances where we failed to manage that. I think this is something is worth starting to talk about right now, before these instances happen, and see how we can create an organized response to these issues. And finally, frankly, some of the rejectionists you will have to deal with in the good old security way. They will shoot, and you'll have to shoot back. We have to understand that there will be that, and to me, it's one of the most remarkable moments that I remember. An Israeli negotiator, who will remain unnamed for this purpose, told us in one of the sessions we were having with them, there will be a moment where a Jew will shoot another Jew in implementation of this agreement. Like we know, there'll be a moment where a Palestinian will have to shoot another Palestinian in implementation of the agreement. And we have to be prepared for that, all of that. Yet I do believe at the end of the day, all of these things put into place, nothing succeeds like success. And ultimately, if there's a peace deal that is credible, where the public feel that their interests actually are going to be met, I think that in itself will generate the public interest. One example of this, actually, the one that you mentioned, touched the issue of the Gaza disengagement, for example. I mean, the Gaza disengagement, which Sharon initiated, was one that was not particularly popular with the Palestinian leadership. We felt there were issues with it, we felt that there were problems with it, yet because it held in it the promise for Palestinians, for average Palestinians in Gaza, the promise of their lives changing, there was tremendous support for this agreement. Equally with the Oslo Agreement, where most Palestinian political commentators were against it. It was a sellout, it was this, it was that. People in the West Bank and Gaza were putting flowers in the barrels of Israeli soldiers' guns because they felt their lives were changing. So ultimately, the rejectionists can reject and they will use violence. Yet I think that the message that they will give will not have much traction if we have a deal that is credible, that is signed on by credible leaders, that has within it the credible promise of change of reality for the public on both sides.
I agree with that. Look, something interesting happened yesterday when Prime Minister Netanyahu was speaking at AIPAC. He began to use that forum to talk about what peace would mean. Meaning he was beginning to do what you have to do. Ghaith was talking about you have to prepare the ground for those who are going to react against it, and one of the ways you do that is by delegitimizing them early on, talking about those who basically want to frustrate the aspirations of each side. And you have to, in a sense, you undercut them by talking about that early. But what Netanyahu was starting to do yesterday was saying, look, there's a lot of things that we will gain from this. You have to prepare the ground for peace. The idea that you're going to spring it and then suddenly everything's going to be fine, that is one of the lessons of the past. It doesn't work that way. So it's not only that you have to show, what the two of us have been talking about so far, and why one of the reasons I focus so heavily on, even now, if there is if the framework gets a yes but, whatever it is, let's say it gets a yes, which I don't expect, but let's say it gets that. If it's a yes but, if it's a no but, no maybe, and it's enough to go on. You have to show something's different. That's part of preparing the ground for doing a deal. And that's part of the way you also deal with the rejectionists, because you build the constituencies who favor this outcome. And that's something that has to be done. It is something that is easier to do in Israel than it is on the Palestinian side, because the political culture on the Palestinian side is simply different. And for a whole lot of reasons, there's a deeper sense of grievance, there's a deeper sense of victimhood, there's a deeper sense that, making compromise isn't somehow legitimate. It's somehow betraying who you are, it's betraying your principles. It becomes a harder thing to do on their side, so you don't see the preparation in advance. But there needs to be, within the bounds of what's possible, there needs to be steps along those lines. For Abu Mazen to, without talking about concessions, to talk about what Palestinians will gain if there's peace. Seems like an obvious thing, but you can't find him making a speech doing that. That should happen. That should be one of the things I would like to see Secretary Kerry do, is if he gets the framework, at the same time, have a series of understandings with the two sides of what they're going to do right afterwards. Not only along the steps that I was talking about, but what are they going to start saying publicly? How about each of you start giving public statements about what peace is going to mean? And when one of you does something that's positive, whether it's a step on the ground or it's a public statement, the other should respond publicly at that moment. So you build, in a sense, momentum behind positive things. We've never had this kind of positive reinforcement. We have exactly the opposite kind. So if you want to take on the rejectionists, you have to create a context in which you make it harder and harder for them to deal. You make them less and less legitimate. You build the constituencies for peace, you act to discredit who they are, and then you'll find, by the way, it's easier to take them on.
I don't know, and just to follow on this, to reconfirm what you said, what's interesting is that both leaders, Netanyahu and Abbas, have said good things, but too few and too far between. And I think it's easier for both of them if you remind them of what they said in the past, and if you insist that they repeat it more frequently and more loudly. I mean, David Makovsky and I actually wrote an article about this in which we enumerated many of the things that were said. Abbas recognizing the connection of the Jewish people to the land, as it is explained in the Quran. Netanyahu's adoption of the two-state solution. So the parties have that. What it takes is to convince them, and maybe to nudge them and to push them to actually do it consistently and repeatedly.
And connect it.
Of course.
When one does it, respond. I mean, every time one of them has said a positive thing, it's like they just tossed a rock in the ocean and it's sunk. And then it's not repeated. Now, you can also understand why they don't repeat it, because they get flack for saying it and they get no reinforcement. They get no benefit for having done it. But that needs to be something that Kerry works out with them as part of doing this. It is not enough to work out how you're going to get over the hump with the framework. That itself has to be tied to a set of very clear things that are going to be done that shows it's a different world the day after this is done than the world before it.
Can I just actually kind of take it one step further, if I may?
We're on a roll right now. We don't,
No, because I mean, I think this is something that requires some more thinking, because it's not only what the two sides can give one another. I mean, one of the things that the U.S. brings into this process, the U.S., the world's sole superpower, et cetera, is it's our ability to inject additional capital into this process where the two sides are unable to bring this capital. There's a lot that we can do to give rewards to the sides, and there's a lot that we can do to convince our allies to give rewards to the sides. I mean, I was looking at the Palestinian newspapers this morning, just checking it on the internet, and guess what was the headlines in the three dailies? It wasn't Netanyahu's speech in AIPAC. It wasn't Netanyahu's meeting with Obama. It was the visit of a Saudi billionaire who came into Ramallah with the whole get-up and the everything, promised to invest some into the West Bank and what have you. This was the headlines. Imagine what if, after the day after, we have 5-6 Arab foreign ministers showing up, each with a big fat check, deposited in the Palestinian treasury. Imagine things like this. So as we build You know, there's a thing that the two sides have to do and no one else can do for them. But there are things that if we feel they are serious, that we can inject, and we can get our allies to inject into this process. So not only work on synchronizing the messaging between the sides, but ensure that the influencers outside the direct sphere are also acting positively.
You know,
Can I just I don't want to, no, but I want to put it in a, I mean, I want to remind us why this is also going to be difficult. You know, we're talking about an issue, and one of the reasons, by the way, that Kerry's been able to do this, and there is a possibility of moving ahead, is because nobody in the region is paying attention to it. The Saudis and others are focused on Iran, Egypt, Syria. They're not focused on this. If you go and you talk to them, they don't talk about this. No one in the region is focused on this. The Egyptians aren't focused on this. Syria obviously isn't focused on this. The Iranians aren't focused on this. Now, that creates political space for the two sides. That's the good news. The bad news is that because they're focused on other things, they will also look at the U.S. And the U.S., if they're, right now, the Saudis, I gave a talk last week in which I'd been out in the area and been talking to Saudis, Emiratis, and Israelis, and I said if I put a blindfold on, I didn't know who I was talking to. Because their preoccupations are on the shifting balance of power in the region, and what they perceive, fairly or not, what they perceive is the U.S. being non-responsive as the balance of power changes. Now, the president is going to go to Saudi Arabia, which is itself a reflection that he gets the fact that we got a problem with them right now. I was saying to Ghaith earlier, I mean, I'm doing a new book that really looks at how the U.S. has approached the region, focused on Israel, but really how we approach the region from Truman through Obama. And there's been a lot of different periods where there's been this kind of dissonance. It's not typically in the public, that's the difference. There's been a couple times when it's been in the public, but it's not typically in the public. And so